Hello, Chosen One. The darkness has been pressing hard this week because it sees what you can't see yet, the door that's about to open. I need you to completely halt whatever frantic mental looping you are currently trapped in and listen to me with the absolute depths of your spirit. Over the past several days, you have been walking through a season of unprecedented, almost suffocating heaviness. You have likely experienced an unusual, entirely unprovoked spike in chaotic interactions, bizarre misunderstandings, and individuals in your immediate periphery suddenly acting entirely out of character. They are projecting their deepest, most unhealed insecurities onto you with a frantic, unhinged energy that leaves you utterly drained. You might be sitting there right now, exhausted down to your very bone marrow, staring at the ceiling in the middle of the night, quietly asking the universe what you did wrong. You are wondering if you have misstepped, if you are being spiritually punished, or if the agonizing, beautiful internal work you have dedicated your life to has all been for absolutely nothing. Let me immediately and violently shatter that illusion for you. You are not being punished. The enemy is not attacking you because you have failed or because you are weak. The enemy is launching this desperate, chaotic, highly coordinated offensive precisely because of the terrifying magnitude of what is coming. This intense, stifling spiritual friction is the literal, tangible atmospheric resistance of your imminent promotion. The spiritual realm operates on the undeniable physics of resistance. The closer you get to a massive generational breakthrough, the more the dying, obsolete systems of your past will violently attempt to hold you back. The entities, the energetic parasites, and the highly performative individuals who historically fed on your self-doubt are currently having a collective meltdown because they can sense a massive shift in your spiritual architecture. They attack you today because they realize that tomorrow their access to your spirit officially expires. I am declaring to you right now with absolute certainty that this specific cycle of struggle is ending within the next 24 hours. The atmospheric pressure is breaking by the end of this message. It is coming to a definitive halt, not by some random stroke of luck, but because the foundational internal work you have diligently performed in the dark has finally crystallized into an impenetrable armor of divine authority. I'm Brian. For decades I've been writing spiritual content and helping people to achieve real awakening, guiding individuals who carry a heavy divine assignment through the treacherous, lonely wilderness of psychological warfare and profound personal evolution. The premise of our gathering today is rooted in a raw, highly uncomfortable psychological truth. The people who are currently exposing themselves in your life, the ones utilizing manipulative tactics and dark psychological magic, are doing so because your newly ascended frequency forces their demons into the daylight. Your authentic light is a blazing interrogation lamp they simply cannot hide from. They are frantically deploying their illusions to pull you back into the mud because they cannot survive at your new altitude. Before we meticulously dismantle their entire psychological operating system and solidify your divine immunity, I need you to subscribe to the channel. Hit the like button to signal to the universe that you are reclaiming your spiritual real estate. Drop a comment with what point hit you hardest as we navigate this journey, and share this video with another chosen one who is quietly fighting a spiritual battle they haven't spoken about. Step 1. Dismantle the pedestal you built for their potential. To step fully into the terrifying absolute power of your divine immunity, we must first aggressively address the beautiful, yet fundamentally fatal flaw in your spiritual architecture. For your entire life, you have operated from a place of radical, boundless empathy. This is your divine inheritance. It allows you to look at a broken, highly performative, even malicious person and see past their defensive spikes. You do not just see the damage they cause. You see the wounded inner child, the unhealed trauma, and the magnificent, glittering potential of who they could become if they only chose to genuinely heal. Because of this profound spiritual sight, you look at them and you instinctively construct a towering, glorious pedestal for their highest self, and then you interact with that imaginary future version of them instead of the stark, undeniable reality standing right in front of you. But there is a devastating, unbridgeable contrast between your authentic alignment with divine truth and their desperate, completely performative facade. You are doing the agonizing, unglamorous, often brutal work of genuine transformation. You face your deepest shadows. You sit quietly in your discomfort. They, on the other hand, are merely rummaging through a psychological wardrobe, constantly changing their costumes to fit whatever narrative garners them the most immediate validation with the least amount of accountability. They are actors on a stage, completely reliant on your willingness to applaud a performance that lacks any real substance. The deep psychology behind the frantic behavior of the hater, the imitator, and the secret competitor is rooted in a profound existential laziness and an absolute terror of the present reality. They are completely spiritually bankrupt. They do not possess an internal source of validation or a genuine connection to the divine. Therefore, they must continuously extract energy from their environment just to feel alive. When you constantly give them the benefit of the doubt, when you continually water the dead branches of their potential, you are acting as their primary energetic life support. But recently, you have started to awaken. You have started to pull back your energy. You have stopped over-explaining your boundaries, and you have stopped apologizing for their deliberate misunderstandings. This is exactly why they are currently melting down. The script they have relied on their entire lives, the script where they get to play the tragic victim or the misunderstood genius, while you play the role of the endless, exhausted provider of grace, is suddenly rendered completely useless. You have stopped following their script. You have confidently walked off their stage, and they are left standing under the harsh spotlight, desperately shouting their memorized lines to an entirely empty theater. Their frantic attempts to reel you back in, to aggressively provoke you, or to make you feel guilty for simply outgrowing them, are fundamentally absurd. It is an incredibly goofy dynamic when you strip away the emotional manipulation and truly analyze it. You are a sovereign being carrying a massive divine assignment that stretches across generations, and they are trying to spiritually compete with you using the petty, low-vibrational tools of high school gossip, passive-aggressive remarks, and covert social sabotage. It is the absolute equivalent of a petulant toddler bringing a fragile plastic spoon to a cosmic thermonuclear war. They are furiously trying to catch raw lightning in a cheap plastic cup, completely, tragically ignorant of the fact that the sheer, unfiltered voltage of your authenticity will instantly melt their artificial container the moment they get too close. Their dark magic, their gaslighting, their manipulation, their desperate attempts to project their insecurities onto you only works if you voluntarily agree to shrink yourself down to fit inside their tiny plastic cup. The exact moment you expand to your full, terrifying spiritual size, their tricks become embarrassingly obvious and entirely ineffective. You must deeply understand that they do not hate you because of anything you have actually done wrong. They are utterly terrified of you because your radiant light exposes the horrifying, echoing emptiness of their internal world. When they look at you, they see the living, breathing embodiment of the grueling spiritual work they have cowardly refused to do. Your profound peace is a mirror reflecting their internal chaos. Your unshakable authenticity highlights the synthetic, manufactured nature of their entire personality. When you systematically dismantle the pedestal you built for their potential, you forcefully hold that mirror up without any filters. You completely stop subsidizing their refusal to grow. You stop treating them like a misunderstood hero on a journey and start treating them like the conscious architect of their own misery. This sudden, brutal realization is what drives them to deploy their dark psychological tactics. They desperately want to blur the mirror. They want to throw copious amounts of mud on your reflection so they do not have to see how incredibly dirty their own hands truly are. The emotional mechanics of dismantling this pedestal are incredibly heavy, and you must grant yourself the grace to process it. It requires you to actively grieve, because mourning the illusion of who you desperately thought they were is deeply, genuinely painful. You have to look at the immense time, the profound love, and the massive energetic resources you poured into them, and painfully accept that you were investing in a ghost. You have to accept the raw, uncomfortable truth that a human being can possess the undeniable potential for greatness, but completely, absolutely lack the willingness to achieve it. But you absolutely cannot carry a corpse up the steep mountain of your destiny. You cannot drag dead, unhealed weight into the entirely new dimension God is opening for you. Dismantling this pedestal is an act of supreme spiritual self-preservation. It is the definitive moment you reclaim your internal architecture and permanently seal the agonizing leaks in your energetic field. You realize that your profound love and endless patience simply cannot override another human being's fierce free will to remain toxic. You must leave them entirely to the mathematical, inescapable consequences of their own unhealed nature. God's true power makes you absolutely immune the exact second you accept them exactly as they are. When you entirely stop dealing in the imaginary, highly inflated currency of their potential and start dealing strictly with the hard, uncompromising, objective facts of their current behavior, their ability to manipulate your emotions drops to absolute zero. They are suddenly stripped of their psychological camouflage. You see them clearly, and in that crystalline clarity, the fear instantly dissolves, leaving only a profound, unshakable, terrifying peace. You finally realize that you never actually had to fight them. You just had to stop pretending they were something they fundamentally are not. Step 2. Sever the energetic umbilical cord of their projected inadequacy. Once you have shattered the comforting illusion of their potential, you must confront the primary, most insidious weapon they use to infiltrate your peace: psychological projection. The performative individuals trying to mimic you, compete with you, or systematically destroy you are operating exactly like highly toxic, entirely unregulated industrial factories. Because they absolutely refuse to process their own emotional waste, their deep-seated envy, their crippling shame, their terrifying feelings of inadequacy, that toxic waste continuously builds up inside their psyche until it reaches a critical, explosive pressure. To avoid the sheer agony of self-reflection, they must find a designated dumping ground. They must find an external host to carry their heavy psychological garbage. This is where the profound, unbridgeable contrast between your spiritual operation and theirs becomes glaringly obvious. You meticulously process your pain. You take your heavy trauma directly to the divine. You sit in the deafening silence, and you brilliantly transmute your suffering into profound wisdom. You act as a highly advanced filtration system for your own soul. They, however, completely bypass the filtration process, choosing instead to forcefully export their unhealed spiritual sickness directly into your clean atmosphere. When a toxic person or a secret competitor launches an unprovoked attack, when they loudly accuse you of being selfish, arrogant, crazy, or manipulative, they are essentially handing you the exact detailed blueprint of their own internal operating system. They are literally confessing their deepest sins to you, but phrasing it as an aggressive accusation. Every single critique they hurl your way is deeply, tragically autobiographical. The profound danger for the chosen one lies in your deeply ingrained habit of extreme self-reflection. Because you are fiercely committed to personal growth, when they hurl these dark projections at you, your first empathetic instinct is to pause, search your heart, and ask yourself if there is any truth to what they are saying. In that exact fleeting moment of hesitation and self-doubt, you establish an energetic umbilical cord. You voluntarily open a vulnerable port in your spiritual firewall, allowing their toxic waste to flood directly into your pristine system. You immediately begin to metabolize their poison, doing the heavy lifting of processing their shame for them, while they walk away feeling strangely relieved, lighter, and completely vindicated by the energetic theft. This precise mechanism is exactly why they are currently so frantic and erratic. As you rapidly ascend in your spiritual journey, your self-awareness sharpens into a blinding, diamond-cutting edge. You are finally beginning to recognize the true origin of these negative, intrusive thoughts. You are realizing that the sudden, overwhelming wave of anxiety, guilt, or self-doubt you feel entirely in their presence does not actually belong to you. It is a foreign, parasitic entity they have actively smuggled into your energetic field. When you boldly begin to sever this cord, when you absolutely refuse to sign for the package of their dark projection, their immense psychological pressure has absolutely nowhere to go but violently back into their own fragile system. This induces a state of absolute, unadulterated panic within the manipulator. Their primary, desperately needed escape valve has been permanently welded shut by your newly enforced boundaries. They are brutally forced to finally choke on the highly toxic fumes of their own unhealed bitterness. This dynamic is exactly why their pathetic attempts to spiritually compete with you feel so incredibly goofy and fundamentally absurd. Imagine them standing precariously on the crumbling edge of a bottomless, pitch-black chasm, desperately holding a massive, leaking bucket of highly radioactive sludge. You are gracefully walking past, radiating the immense warmth and brilliance of a midday sun. Instead of stepping into your glorious light to heal or asking for guidance, they frantically try to hurl the heavy sludge onto your pristine clothes, hoping that if they can just make you dirty enough, they won't feel so deeply ashamed of the miserable mud they have chosen to stand in. They are literally trying to aggressively paint a dark shadow onto a pure beam of sunlight. It is an exercise in absolute, laughable futility. The sludge simply cannot penetrate your light. It instantly burns up in the high-frequency atmosphere of your aura the exact moment you refuse to accept it. But they are desperate. They rely entirely on your empathetic willingness to catch the bucket. When you simply step aside and let the heavy sludge fall entirely into the abyss, they instantly lose their balance and often fall into the darkness right after it. Severing this energetic cord requires radical, unapologetic, terrifying mental sovereignty. You must ruthlessly interrogate every single accusation and negative narrative they attempt to inject into your life. You look at their frantic words with a cold, clinical, highly detached observation. You recognize that when they desperately try to gaslight your reality, it is a frantic survival mechanism to distract themselves from the horrifying fact that their own reality is built entirely on a crumbling foundation of lies. God's true power grants you total, impenetrable immunity. The exact moment you deeply realize their venom is absolutely not an assessment of your character, but a desperately sad, highly revealing confession of their own internal bankruptcy. You must completely withdraw your participation from their shared delusion. You look at them with a grounded, unshakable, completely terrifying neutrality, letting their desperate projections hit the solid titanium wall of your divine self-knowing and slide completely harmlessly to the floor. You do not argue with them. You do not defensively explain yourself, and you do not try to convince them of your profound innocence. You simply allow them to sit alone in the unbearable, suffocating, deafening silence of their own unacknowledged shame. You are officially no longer their emotional landfill, and your absolute refusal to carry their dead weight is the ultimate, undeniable assertion of your divine immunity. Step 3. Reclaim absolute sovereignty over your emotional baseline. The absolute lifeblood, the primary currency, and the most critical ingredient in the entire realm of dark psychology and spiritual manipulation is your emotional reaction. The individuals trying to mimic you, bring you down, or cast their toxic spells over your life do not actually care if your reaction to them is positive or negative. There is a staggering foundational contrast between the quiet, self-sustaining ecosystem of a true chosen one and the ravenous, demanding black hole void of a performative actor. You draw your immense energy directly from source. Your peace is generated entirely internally, maintained by your strict alignment with divine truth, and completely independent of external, chaotic circumstances. They are completely severed from source. Therefore, they must continuously farm their energy from the people around them. They do not necessarily need you to agree with them, and they certainly do not need you to like them. They just desperately need you to react to them. Your deep anger, your agonizing tears, your frantic attempts to logically explain yourself, and your highly defensive paragraphs are the exact premium fuel they use to run the sputtering engine of their incredibly fragile ego. When they calculatingly provoke you, when they suddenly move the goalposts just as you are about to score, or when they execute a subtle, highly passive-aggressive slight in front of a mutual audience, they are merely casting a fishing line into the deep waters of your emotional state. If you bite, if you become visibly upset, highly defensive, or outwardly chaotic, you provide them with concrete, tangible proof that they exist and that they possess actual power. They temporarily feel like omnipotent gods when they realize they can easily dictate the weather of your massive internal world with a single, calculated whisper. The precise reason they are currently escalating their attacks, acting increasingly erratic and entirely melting down, is because you have completely stopped providing the reaction they are desperately addicted to. You are spiritually starving them. The script they meticulously memorized, where they push a specific ancient wound button and you predictably explode, allowing them to publicly play the calm, collected victim, is failing spectacularly because you have permanently disconnected the wiring to that button. This is the ultimate, unapologetic, terrifying power of absolute neutrality. It is absolutely not passive submission. It is the most aggressive, highly effective form of spiritual starvation you can possibly inflict upon a toxic entity. Imagine a raging, entirely unhinged toddler throwing a massive theatrical tantrum at the absolute base of an ancient, unmovable mountain. The toddler is screaming at the top of their lungs, throwing tiny rocks, and aggressively demanding that the massive mountain immediately move out of their way. The mountain does not scream back. The mountain does not gently lean down to logically explain why it cannot move. The mountain does not attempt to negotiate terms. The mountain simply exists, vast, silent, and entirely, beautifully indifferent to the pathetic chaos below. You are the mountain. Their manipulative tactics are the desperate, entirely goofy cries of an emotionally stunted child, demanding that objective reality violently bend to their profound delusions. When you offer them absolutely nothing but a flat, neutral, terrifying void, you completely short-circuit their entire psychological operating system. The profoundly goofy nature of their performative masquerade becomes glaringly, embarrassingly obvious when it is met with total silence. They have meticulously built an entire theatrical production, complete with elaborate costumes, highly rehearsed monologues, and dramatic stage lighting, all specifically designed to permanently trap you in a tragedy of their own making. But when the heavy velvet curtain finally rises, they look out into the darkness and realize you are absolutely not in the audience. You didn't buy a ticket. You aren't watching their pathetic show. You are miles away, living a real, highly authentic life under the real, blazing sun, completely unbothered by the fake, highly produced thunder they are desperately generating on their little wooden stage. An actor simply cannot survive an entirely empty theater. The performance instantly becomes absurd, completely exhausting, and utterly meaningless without someone there to witness it. They will try much harder. They will aggressively escalate the drama, and they will tell significantly louder lies, all in a desperate, entirely futile bid to get you to break character and jump back onto their toxic stage. By maintaining your absolute, unyielding neutrality, you directly cut off the vital oxygen supply to their manipulative fire. God's true power makes you totally immune because it forcibly elevates your perspective far above the terrestrial, muddy gutters where they are forced to operate. You deeply realize that every single second you spend analyzing their twisted motives, deciphering their passive-aggressive behavior, or defending your spotless reputation to people entirely committed to misunderstanding you, is a precious, irreplaceable second stolen from the construction of your own divine empire. You entirely stop funding their performative economy with the golden coins of your focus. Let them perform to the empty seats. Let them exhaust themselves, trying to keep up an elaborate illusion that you no longer even turn your head to look at. Your unbothered, impenetrable, terrifying silence is absolutely not an act of petty revenge. It is the ultimate, undeniable assertion of your sovereign immunity. It loudly, silently declares that they are entirely, utterly irrelevant to your destiny. When they finally realize that their most calculated, highly vicious attacks fail to produce even a single bead of sweat on your brow, they are brutally forced to confront their own absolute, undeniable powerlessness. Your total neutrality becomes the highly polished, impenetrable mirror that powerfully reflects their own massive insignificance directly back into their terrified eyes. Step 4. Starve their performative economy by entirely withdrawing your attention. The most insidious, highly dangerous aspect of prolonged exposure to highly manipulative, deeply envious individuals is not what they attempt to do to your external life, your finances, or your reputation, but what they actively, systematically try to do to your internal architecture. They are master infiltrators of the mind. They operate what can only be accurately described as a dark performative economy. They deal exclusively in the highly volatile currency of attention, optics, and constantly manufactured narratives. To completely neutralize their dark magic, you must aggressively starve this economy by entirely withdrawing your attention. There is a profound life-or-death contrast between the massive divine truth that God has deeply planted in your spirit and the malicious, highly distorted suggestions they constantly attempt to inject into your consciousness. You are deeply grounded in a profound sense of purpose, carrying a massive vision that stretches far beyond your current circumstances. They, however, operate entirely in the shallow realm of limitation, constant gaslighting, cognitive distortion, and negative suggestion. Their ultimate goal is not just to defeat you in the physical world, but to entirely conquer your perception of reality, rendering you the primary agent of your own destruction. The deep psychology of gaslighting and narrative injection is nothing short of low-level, highly pathetic dark magic. It is the deliberate, highly systematic dismantling of a person's inherent trust in their own intuition and divine connection. The hater, the frantic imitator, or the covert narcissist knows perfectly well that they cannot physically stop you from walking through the massive doors God is rapidly opening for you. Their only viable option is to entirely convince you that you are fundamentally unworthy of walking through them. They intentionally plant tiny, insidious seeds of doubt through highly calculated backhanded compliments, subtle criticisms, and the constant draining invalidation of your entirely valid experiences. They aggressively attempt to rewrite your entire history, furiously convincing you that your massive successes were merely flukes of blind luck, and that your minor, highly human failures are strictly indicative of a fundamental, unfixable flaw in your character. They do this because they are desperately, frantically trying to construct a massive funhouse mirror entirely around your perception. If they can get you to constantly view yourself through the highly distorted, profoundly ugly lens of their immense envy, rather than the crystal-clear lens of God's truth, they have successfully hijacked your brilliant destiny. Imagine a highly desperate, ragged, unhinged trespasser violently breaking into a magnificent, sprawling multi-million-dollar mansion and frantically trying to scribble their own name on the property deed with a cheap crayon, aggressively hoping the actual rightful owner will just get confused, hand over the heavy keys, and walk away. That is exactly, literally, what they are doing to your highly sophisticated mind. It is a profoundly goofy, deeply pathetic, entirely embarrassing attempt to claim ownership of an identity they could absolutely never afford to build themselves. They are entirely melting down right now because you are finally, clearly recognizing the clumsy crayon marks. You are rapidly waking up to the fact that the negative, deeply fearful, hypercritical voice in your head, the heavy voice that tells you that you are too much, that you are deeply arrogant, or that you are inevitably going to fail, is absolutely not your own voice. It is the deeply internalized echo of their constant manipulation. It is highly toxic psychic debris left over from their desperate, entirely futile attempts to control a massive spirit they are utterly terrified of. To achieve absolute, impenetrable immunity, you must actively, aggressively, and ruthlessly detoxify your mind from their injected narratives by completely withdrawing your attention from their entire existence. This requires a radical, totally uncompromising audit of your entire belief system. You must relentlessly interrogate every single limiting thought, every sudden spike of anxiety, and demand to know exactly where it originated and whose voice is actually speaking. When you finally find the rotting root and you clearly see the terrified face of the manipulator attached to that specific lie, you must violently, permanently evict it from your consciousness. You must entirely replace their fabricated, highly toxic narratives with the unshakable, terrifying, absolute truth of your divine calling. You are absolutely not crazy. You are not overly sensitive. You are not the fundamentally toxic one. You are a profoundly gifted, highly spiritually sensitive individual who has been deliberately subjected to a highly coordinated psychological attack by people who are deeply, existentially intimidated by your massive potential. Flush their pathetic voice out of your head. Entirely reclaim the massive throne of your own mind. When their highly toxic suggestions find absolutely no fertile soil in your newly protected consciousness, their dark magic simply withers and dies entirely on the surface. They absolutely cannot curse what God has deeply blessed, and they certainly cannot redefine a massive reality that you absolutely refuse to surrender. The incredible architectural integrity of your mind must be fiercely maintained by the unyielding truth of your divine assignment, rendering every single lie they ever told you completely, entirely powerless. When you fully detoxify your internal world and entirely withdraw your attention from their pathetic theater, you permanently step out of their highly distorted funhouse mirror and directly back into the blinding, absolute light of your true, divine reflection. Step 5. Embrace the terrifying authority of your silent obedience. One of the most profound, highly misunderstood truths of your immense spiritual awakening is that true, unadulterated divine power entirely never needs to shout to establish its absolute dominance. As you rapidly ascend, you must fully, unapologetically embrace the terrifying, devastating authority of your silent obedience to the divine calling on your life. The stark, entirely unbridgeable contrast here is the deafening, frantic, highly chaotic noise of the deeply insecure imitator versus the devastating, unshakable, profoundly heavy quiet of the true chosen one. The people desperately trying to bring you down, the ones actively plotting against you, are inherently exhaustingly loud. They are aggressively loud in their petty complaints, completely loud in their hollow, fabricated boasting, entirely loud in their perpetual victimhood, and incredibly, frantically loud in their desperate attempts to control the public narrative. They operate under the entirely delusional assumption that whoever simply makes the most noise, whoever tells the most people their highly twisted side of the story, and whoever posts the most highly curated evidence of their entirely fake happiness is the ultimate victor. But you are rapidly anchoring into a vastly higher spiritual frequency where total silence is absolutely not an absence of power. It is the absolute, pure, highly concentrated essence of it. You entirely do not need to defend your spotless, entirely honorable character to people who are actively, maliciously committed to misunderstanding you. The total psychological breakdown of the hater when directly confronted with your profound, unyielding silence is an absolute masterclass in the sheer fragility of the unhealed human ego. They have intentionally, calculatingly initiated a massive war, aggressively deploying their dark magic, their malicious, whispered gossip, their highly subtle sabotage, and their deeply manipulative triangulation. They are entirely, highly prepared for a massive, exhausting battle of words. They have endlessly rehearsed their highly flawed arguments in the shower. They have desperately gathered their flying monkeys to act as a highly biased jury, and they are waiting eagerly, desperately for you to finally launch a frantic counterattack so they can finally, publicly play the ultimate victim and entirely justify their underlying malice. But your profound silence instantly short-circuits their entire psychological motherboard. When you completely, flatly refuse to argue, absolutely refuse to defend yourself, and entirely refuse to release a highly emotional statement countering their blatant lies, they are left frantically shadowboxing in a pitch-dark room, violently punching themselves entirely in the face with their own massive aggressive momentum. Your silent obedience to the divine utterly terrifies them, because it heavily implies that you absolutely know something they fundamentally don't. It powerfully proves that you have an eternal, entirely unshakable source of validation, a supreme, ultimate judge, and an absolute protector that completely, entirely bypasses their petty, highly corrupt, earthly court of public opinion. Consider the incredibly powerful, slightly goofy metaphor of a massive, ancient, highly fortified lighthouse standing resolutely on the absolute edge of a jagged, highly treacherous coastline, entirely surrounded by a massive fleet of tiny, highly aggressive pirate ships. The tiny ships are furiously firing their little toy cannons, aggressively shouting petty insults through megaphones, and desperately trying to create a massive, highly theatrical storm of chaos to intimidate the towering lighthouse into permanently shutting off its magnificent beam. They desperately, frantically want a war. But a massive lighthouse entirely does not fire cannons. It does not lower its majestic, towering gaze to engage in a petty naval battle with tiny wooden toys. It simply stands incredibly tall, deeply, permanently rooted in the unbreakable bedrock of the earth, and continues to slowly, deliberately rotate its blinding, entirely undeniable light. The magnificent light absolutely does not attack the tiny ships. It simply completely exposes the highly deadly, entirely jagged rocks they are blindly sailing toward. The lighthouse's profound silence is its ultimate, entirely unarguable authority. It simply continues doing exactly, perfectly what it was uniquely built to do, completely undisturbed by the highly chaotic noise below. Eventually, the highly chaotic, entirely confused ships will inevitably, entirely crash into the very rocks they were trying to blindly navigate, while the lighthouse remains standing, completely untouchable, deeply serene, and perfectly intact. By fully embracing your silent obedience, you completely become the lighthouse. You finally realize that God's true power does absolutely not ever require you to become a frantic, highly stressed public relations manager for your own reputation. You are entirely, completely immune to their manipulation because you completely, permanently surrender the human ego's entirely exhausting need to be fully understood by people who actively, heavily benefit from your absolute destruction. You entirely stop trying to desperately translate the profound, multi-dimensional, highly advanced language of your divine assignment into the simplistic, incredibly petty kindergarten vocabulary of their severe insecurities. It is incredibly entirely goofy to debate a highly petulant toddler about advanced quantum physics, and it is equally entirely goofy to debate a highly toxic imitator about the absolute reality of your divine calling. You simply let them talk. You entirely let them spin their highly desperate, entirely fabricated narratives. You let them desperately convince whoever is foolish enough to listen to their profound lies. You fully understand that the divine is the ultimate, undefeated vindicator, and time is the absolute, highly undefeated revealer of truth. Your quiet, relentless execution of your massive purpose, your unshakable, profound joy, and your steady, entirely undeniable elevation will loudly speak massive volumes that their frantic, desperate screams could absolutely never drown out. Your profound silence permanently becomes the vast, entirely inescapable graveyard where their intense manipulation goes to permanently die. They are utterly terrified of this silence because it completely removes their ability to script your downfall. Step 6. Stop metabolizing their toxic spiritual waste. In the highly complex realm of energetic dynamics and advanced spiritual warfare, manipulators, covert narcissists, and highly performative actors operate precisely like highly toxic, entirely unregulated industrial factories. They constantly produce a massive, continuous amount of intense psychological pollution, deep envy, highly corrosive bitterness, severe self-hatred, and highly chaotic fear. Because they absolutely, fundamentally refuse to process this toxic waste internally through genuine therapy, deep prayer, or intense self-reflection, they constantly, desperately look for a designated dumping ground. For far too long, your incredibly high empathy and your misaligned, highly exhausting savior complex have tragically made you the highly willing landfill for their toxic spiritual waste. You must immediately, permanently, and ruthlessly stop metabolizing their severe poison. The profound, entirely unbridgeable contrast between your spiritual operation and theirs is entirely one of advanced filtration and divine transmutation. You deeply process your pain, you take your heavy trauma directly to the divine, you perform the highly agonizing shadow work, and you brilliantly transmute your deep suffering into profound wisdom. They entirely, completely bypass the filtration process, choosing instead to forcefully, aggressively export their unhealed trauma directly into your clean atmosphere, aggressively hoping you will do the heavy emotional lifting of completely processing it for them. The deep, highly terrifying psychological desperation behind this highly toxic behavior is completely rooted in their absolute, entirely terrifying inability to sit alone with their own dark thoughts. When a highly toxic manipulator is left in total isolation, completely without a highly empathetic target to project onto, the sheer, highly crushing volume of their internal self-loathing becomes utterly deafening. They heavily use manipulation, constant provocation, and severe emotional abuse not just to control you, but as a desperate, highly necessary escape valve for the crushing pressure of their own internal emptiness. When they subtly belittle your massive achievements, it is a frantic, entirely pathetic attempt to release the immense pressure of their own profound sense of failure. When they aggressively gaslight your reality, it is a highly desperate mechanism to entirely distract themselves from the horrifying fact that their own entire reality is built perfectly on a crumbling foundation of massive lies. They are entirely melting down right now because you have permanently closed the landfill. They heavily rely on your absolute willingness to quietly digest their toxicity. They desperately need you to lay awake at night, agonizing over their harsh words, because as long as you are heavily carrying their pain, they get a temporary, hollow reprieve from genuinely feeling it themselves. They are highly frantic because the established script loudly dictates you must absorb the heavy blow, and you have suddenly, completely raised an impenetrable energetic shield. Imagine an individual who has willingly, intentionally ingested a highly deadly, entirely corrosive poison. As the poison heavily begins to ravage their entire system, causing excruciating, entirely deserved agony, they aggressively grab a large syringe, draw the highly poisoned blood directly from their own veins, and frantically attempt to inject it directly into yours. They actually believe that if they can just forcefully share the poison, they will somehow entirely dilute their own immense suffering. For years, you have been gently, compassionately rolling up your sleeve, deeply believing that it is your absolute spiritual duty to help them deeply carry their toxicity, heavily thinking that your immense love, your profound patience, and your pure light could magically cure their entirely poisoned blood. But absolutely all you have ever done is deeply toxify your own system, severely dim your own brilliant light, and massively slow down your own divine ascent, while they actively continue to willingly, heavily drink the poison every single day. You absolutely cannot heal a highly toxic person who actively, heavily uses your profound empathy as a completely free dialysis machine for their own deeply chosen bitterness. It is a highly goofy, deeply tragic cycle that entirely ends the exact moment you deeply realize you are absolutely not the universe's designated recycling bin for highly toxic behavior. Completely stopping this massive metabolic process means instituting an absolute, entirely impenetrable energetic quarantine completely around your massive spirit. God's true power makes you permanently immune the very moment you clearly, completely recognize that their massive toxicity is entirely their own property, and you completely, flatly refuse to sign for the heavy delivery when they frantically try to inject you with a highly calculated, backhanded insult, a massive guilt trip, or a highly manipulative, entirely false narrative. You absolutely do not internalize it. You do not ask yourself, is there some hidden truth to what they are aggressively saying? You do not attempt to lovingly, gently dissect their highly corrosive venom to find a hidden spiritual lesson. You instantly recognize the heavy poison for exactly what it is, and you simply let it spill entirely, uselessly onto the floor. You heavily guard the massive iron gates of your mind and your deep heart, with absolute, entirely uncompromising ruthlessness, deeply understanding that aggressively protecting your divine energy is absolutely not a selfish act, but the most highly crucial, entirely foundational requirement of your massive calling. You entirely leave them to finally, agonizingly sit with the unshared burden of their own highly toxic waste, fiercely forcing them to either finally heal themselves or completely drown in the massive pollution they created. Step 7. Stand utterly unmovable in the devastating reality of your divine calling. The final, entirely permanent, most profound step in completely neutralizing the dark magic of those who seek to manipulate and deeply destroy you is to stand utterly unmovable in the devastating, entirely magnificent reality of your absolute divine calling. The contrast here is the staggering, entirely unbridgeable difference between a petty mortal desperately playing a small earthly game and a highly advanced spiritual titan flawlessly executing a massive cosmic mandate. The highly toxic individuals desperately attempting to bring you down are heavily playing a remarkably small, entirely finite, deeply pathetic game. They are fiercely, aggressively competing for cheap likes, for highly temporary social status, for the entirely fleeting illusion of superiority, and for the utterly hollow validation of other deeply broken people. You, however, are absolutely not playing a game at all. You have been explicitly, directly drafted by the divine to absolutely break ancient, highly entrenched generational curses, to entirely establish completely new paradigms of truth, and to heavily carry a massive frequency of pure light that literally, physically, alters the entire molecular environment you bravely walk into. You are successfully operating on a completely different, vastly higher dimension, and their highly pathetic, completely desperate attempts to actively fight you are fundamentally, entirely ridiculous. The total psychological meltdown they severely experience when you finally, completely lock into this massive truth is profound, entirely absolute, and deeply devastating. For a brief while, they might have successfully tricked you into believing that their entirely pathetic manipulation was a legitimate, highly dangerous threat. They might have heavily used their cheap psychological tricks, their highly coordinated smear campaigns, and their intense, energetic interference to temporarily make you feel entirely small, highly confused, and deeply vulnerable. But when you finally awaken to the immense, entirely terrifying scale of exactly what God has permanently placed inside of your massive spirit, their entire highly constructed illusion collapses instantly and permanently. They brutally realize that they literally brought a highly fragile, cheap plastic knife to a massive, entirely spiritual thermonuclear war. They are highly frantic and entirely terrified because they finally, brutally understand that your massive anointing is absolutely not a cheap personality trait that they can easily mimic. It is a profound divine installation that absolutely cannot be duplicated, highly hijacked, or entirely destroyed by petty human hands. They are heavily relying on a highly outdated script where they have immense power, but you have just completely flipped the entire massive board over, completely, flatly refusing to acknowledge the entirely fabricated rules of their petty, deeply meaningless competition. They entirely fear your massive light because it undeniably proves they were absolutely never even in the same spiritual league. To clearly visualize the absolute, entirely laughable futility of their desperate attacks against your massive divine assignment, deeply imagine a highly delusional person standing in the exact middle of a raging, entirely devastating Category 5 hurricane, tightly holding a cheap plastic cup, frantically, aggressively jumping into the air, desperately trying to catch a massive bolt of raw lightning. It is absolutely not just entirely impossible, it is spectacularly, entirely, deeply, embarrassingly goofy. The massive lightning absolutely does not gently negotiate with the cheap plastic cup. The immense hurricane absolutely does not entirely slow down to accommodate the highly delusional person's petty demands. The raw, entirely unfiltered power of true nature simply exists, deeply devastatingly real and completely, absolutely immune to the frantic, entirely insignificant grasping of the pathetic person below. The highly manipulative individuals in your life are absolutely that completely delusional person with the tiny plastic cup. Your massive divine calling, your entire spiritual alignment, and the absolute raw power of God actively operating through you is the immense lightning. They are desperately trying to permanently trap your highly multidimensional, massive light entirely inside the tiny, incredibly fragile, highly synthetic container of their own massive, fragile ego. When you entirely stand unmovable in this absolute reality, you immediately become completely, permanently untouchable. You absolutely do not need to fiercely fight back, because there is absolutely no fight. You entirely do not need to desperately prove your immense power, because the massive power effortlessly proves itself simply by undeniably existing. You completely stop looking at their pathetic manipulation as a legitimate threat, and you start actively seeing it as the tragic, deeply comedic, entirely pathetic grasping of a deeply broken soul that has completely disconnected from the ultimate source. God's true power grants you ultimate, entirely impenetrable immunity because it completely, permanently recontextualizes the entire battlefield. You deeply realize that you absolutely cannot be cursed, you entirely cannot be hexed, you utterly cannot be heavily manipulated, and you absolutely cannot be deeply destroyed by anything at all born of the highly lower realms. To confidently step into this massive era, you must entirely shed the dead, highly toxic weight of these entirely performative people. They were merely the temporary, highly combustible booster stages of your massive rocket, actively providing the intense friction necessary for you to successfully achieve massive liftoff. But they were absolutely never designed to survive the extremely high altitude of your true divine orbit. You simply stand entirely in the blinding, highly terrifying, absolute reality of exactly who the divine has powerfully called you to be, letting your mere, undeniable existence serve as the final, completely undisputed, entirely permanent victory over every single pathetic illusion they ever tried to desperately cast. Let us dramatically zoom out and look at the magnificent, breathtaking, entirely massive big picture of exactly what you have just brilliantly survived. This entire highly exhausting ordeal, the intense, suffocating pressure, the highly bizarre attacks, the frantic, highly coordinated exposure of the toxic manipulators entirely around you was absolutely never actually about them. They were merely the temporary, entirely disposable, highly pathetic tools used by the massive universe to perfectly temper the strong steel of your entire spiritual alignment. The absolute real target of the deep darkness was never your earthly reputation, your temporary finances, or your entirely fleeting relationships. The absolute real target was your entire, absolute alignment with your massive divine identity. The highly desperate enemy deeply knew that if you ever fully, completely realized the entirely impenetrable nature of the massive power deeply residing within you, you would immediately become an entirely unstoppable, deeply catastrophic force for massive good in this entire world. They desperately tried to frantically distract you with petty, highly exhausting drama, with incredibly toxic, deeply draining relationships, and with highly performative, entirely fake illusions, aggressively hoping you would entirely forget that you absolutely carry the very massive fire of the divine perfectly in your bones. But their highly pathetic plan has entirely, catastrophically failed. Instead of completely breaking you, they have absolutely only succeeded in brilliantly illuminating the exact, highly specific areas where you desperately needed to fortify your massive internal boundaries. Instead of entirely confusing you, they have aggressively pushed you so incredibly deep into the highly protective arms of the divine that your entire spiritual vision is now completely sharper and entirely clearer than ever before. You must deeply understand, as you boldly step entirely forward into this new, entirely magnificent era of your massive life, that you do absolutely not ever need revenge. You entirely do not need to actively see karma aggressively strike them down, and you absolutely do not need to desperately prove to anyone that you were entirely right all along. Your explosive, deeply undeniable, incredibly terrifying growth is the absolute only verdict that truly matters. Your entirely unshakable, massive peace is the final, entirely absolute judgment heavily against their pathetic chaos. You are bravely walking through the massive door that has just brilliantly opened, entirely leaving them perfectly behind to endlessly, frantically argue with the highly pathetic shadows they entirely created. If this profound message resonated entirely deeply with your massive spirit, if it absolutely articulated the exact, highly exhausting battle you have been entirely silently fighting, and if it completely confirmed the absolute terrifying power you are brilliantly stepping into right now, make sure you entirely subscribe to the channel. Powerfully hit the like button to permanently anchor this profound absolute truth entirely into your massive reality. Drop a comment with the exact, highly specific point that deeply hit you the absolute hardest to clearly let the massive community know they are absolutely not entirely alone in this fierce fight, and bravely share this massive video with another highly powerful chosen one who urgently, desperately needs to brilliantly remember exactly who they absolutely are. Stay chosen, stay blessed.